I call the honourable member Simon Bridges.
Speaker, I'm exceptionally thankful that I've never been the victim of a very serious crime. I've met, of course, like others in this Parliament, will have a number of victims of serious crime, and we can see how hard that is. Perhaps the hospitalisation, the physical pain of it all, but also, of course, the emotional torture of looking behind one's back, nightmares, being fearful, and then sometimes, in the worst of cases, the rebrutalisation through the court process. And I often think that actually for the families of victims, because we know now that victims aren't just the person to whom the crime has happened, it's wider than that. The families of victims, certainly in the most serious of crimes, can be even more badly affected. They can be the ones who have to live on while their loved one is gone, or perhaps in a state where they can no longer communicate with them, or what have you. And for them it's even worse, I think, sometimes, because they have no power to do anything. They may not be a witness or have any role in the court process. And I've heard psychologists talk about this, that it's very difficult for them to get their head around the fact that this may just be a random thing. They want to ascribe some sort of faithfulness to it. Did they deserve it? What had they done? Why them? And it's all very well for others to say, look, move on. They can't just move on. And so we here come to this bill and the history of victims' rights in this country. We're today starting the process, well, it's really been started some time ago, but of implementing the government's reform package regarding of victims of crime. And the ultimate aim, of course, of any society, Mr. Speaker, should actually be not to how we treat victims, but to have less victims. And I think that's probably why the crime statistics have received some attention the last few days, because ultimately what they mean, of course, is less victims of crime. That should be the ultimate goal. But of course we live in a society where sadly there will always, I think, be victims, and we do need to, certainly in the court process and every step of the way, treat them with dignity and respect, and where possible give them a voice. And I've talked before in this House about the history of victims' rights in this country. I give credit to the Labor government for passing the Victim Rights Act 2002. It's an important piece of legislation. It gave victims the right to make a statement in court, and it broadened the definition of victim, as I've said, because victims aren't just the people to whom crime happens in a time or place. They're also their families and sometimes other loved ones. And so this bill goes further, and so it should. It strengthens existing provisions of the law and expands the rights of victims. It amends quite a number of pieces of legislation, and I just want to, there's many things that the bill does, I just want to pick up on one, not necessarily even the most important thing, but one thing it does, which is to widen the scope of victim impact statements that victims of crime can give. And I've talked about how already today in courts victims can give victim impact statements about the effect of the crime. But there's been a number of limitations on victims. They can't say anything today about disposition, that is about the sentence that they think that the offender should have. They can't be, I suppose, unduly emotive, in fact, emotive really at all. And I've, as a prosecutor, had to go through and vivid out things that victims have said before it goes to the judge, as if somehow the judge will be offended by these statements or something like that. And, you know, in the past I've done that. There's been times when I haven't been able to. And the police officers had to go back to the victim. And the victim, as you might think, will say, well, I thought it was my victim impact statement. And quite right, that's how it should be. So we're amending the law so that victims can be much freer in their victim impact statements. Judges, of course, shouldn't be swayed by the overly lenient or overly vexatious victim. It's right that, a particular crime, say a wounding with a knife, in similar circumstances should receive about the same penalty at law. But I know that judges are up to the task of taking all that a victim has to say with the emotions, with the statements like, I wish he'd rot in hell or rot in jail. They are wise enough, and frankly they're paid enough to take that. So that one small aspect of this bill is welcome, along with many other things, and this is an advancement for victim rights in this country.
I call the honourable